She was 51 years old, and she had exactly $4.60 to her name, a carpet bag of mended clothes, and nowhere in the world that would call itself home. Her husband's brother, Walton Marsh, had waited scarcely 3 weeks after the funeral to stand in the doorway of the hardware store she and Thomas had built together for 22 years and tell her, without once meeting her eyes, that the deed had always been in his family's name, and that she would need to be gone by the first frost. She left Cedar Falls with what she could carry and took the eastbound train as far as her money would allow, which was a rail junction town called Millbrook, where the depot clerk mentioned, almost as a joke, that the yard was auctioning off an old sealed boxcar nobody had been able to open in 38 years, cursed or jammed shut, nobody quite knew which. Going for whatever a fool would pay. She paid $5 for it. It seemed the most foolish purchase a ruined woman could make. But sealed inside that rusted car was something that would take a locksmith's daughter's steady hands, a dead man's forgotten courage, and 38 years of silence to finally set free. And by the time it was over, it would not only save her life, but give an entire town back its name. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adeline Marsh. If you're watching this from a place that feels forgotten tonight, tell us where you're writing from in the comments. We'd love to know we're not so far apart after all. Adeline Whitcomb had grown up in the back room of her father's locksmith shop in a river town in Ohio, and long before she learned to read music or embroider a hem, she had learned the language of tumblers and wards, of springs that gave just so under a patient hand. Ezra Whitcomb had no sons, and rather than mourn that fact, he had simply raised his daughter as though the absence of a boy changed nothing about what a person could learn to do. By the time she was 9, she could pick the practice locks he kept on a board by the workbench faster than the apprentices twice her age. By the time she was 14, men from 3 counties brought their strongboxes and their grandfather's iron chests to Ezra's shop, and it was often Adeline's small, careful fingers that coaxed the mechanisms back to life while her father stood by, beaming, calling her his best pupil, though she was, in truth, his only one. He used to say that a lock was not a wall but a conversation, that it was built by a man who wanted to be understood by exactly one other person, and that patience, not force, was the only key that ever truly worked. She carried that lesson the way other women carried a mother's ring. It was at 18 that she met Thomas Marsh, a quiet, sturdy young man from Nebraska who had come east to buy tools for a hardware business he meant to build with his brother, and who lingered in her father's shop 3 extra days on invented errands simply to hear her talk about mechanisms and springs. They married within the year, and Adeline left Ohio for the flat gold country of the Nebraska plains, where she and Thomas built the Marsh brothers' hardware and supply out of little more than lumber, stubbornness, and each other. Walton, Thomas's younger brother, worked the counter and kept the books, or claimed to. Adeline kept the actual accounts in a second ledger she never mentioned. Because even in those early years she had noticed how numbers seemed to slip through Walton's fingers like water through a cracked pail. Thomas never wanted to see it. He loved his brother with the same plain loyalty he gave to everything, and Adeline, who loved Thomas more than she had words for, let the matter lie, year after year. Because peace seemed a small enough price for a happy marriage. They had no children, a sorrow they carried together quietly, the way 2 people carry a weight that would break either one alone but is bearable shared. Instead, Adeline poured what mothering she had into the town itself. She fixed locks for widows who couldn't pay, taught a neighbor girl the trade the way her father had taught her, kept a drawer of penny candy for children who came in with their fathers, and became, without ever seeking the title, the person Cedar Falls trusted with anything that needed careful, unhurried hands. Thomas used to tell her that she had never met a broken thing she didn't think was worth saving, and she used to tell him that was because broken things were usually only misunderstood, not ruined. She believed that the way other people believed in Scripture. Thomas took ill in the spring of his 53rd year, a wasting fever that the doctor could not name and could not stop, and Adeline sat beside him through 11 weeks of slow decline, holding his hand through nights so long she stopped believing morning would come at all. He died in June, in the same bed they had shared for 22 years, and Adeline discovered, in the raw weeks after, that grief has a particular cruelty, it does not pause for practical matters. Even as practical matters refuse to pause for it. That cruelty had a name, and its name was Walton. Within days of the funeral he began speaking of the store's future in a tone that no longer included her, and Adeline, still numb, still moving through her days as though underwater, did not immediately understand what she was hearing. It was only when she asked to see the deed, out of habit more than suspicion, that the shape of it became clear. Walton had, years before, quietly transferred the property into his sole name during a refinancing Thomas had trusted him to handle. A piece of paper Thomas had signed without reading closely because he did not believe his own brother capable of such a thing. Adeline believed it, because she had watched Walton's hands in the ledgers for 2 decades, and she had simply never imagined he would turn those same habits on her. He did not shout. He did not even seem ashamed. He told her, standing in the doorway of the store that bore her husband's name, that the business belonged to the Marsh family, and that she, strictly speaking, was not a Marsh by blood. Only by marriage, and that he was sure she would understand a man's need to look after his own future. He gave her 3 weeks. Adeline spent those 3 weeks doing what she did best, taking apart the mechanism of her life piece by piece, examining what could be salvaged, and finding, to her grief, that very little could. Neighbors who had known her 20 years found reasons not to meet her eye, uneasy at taking sides against a man who still controlled the only hardware store for 30 miles. Her father was long dead. There were no children to shelter her, no other family to call on. When the frost came, as Walton had promised it would, she boarded an eastbound train with a carpet bag, her father's old lock-picking tools wrapped in a handkerchief, and $4.60. Because that was, after the debts were settled, all that remained of 22 years. She did not know where she was going. She simply rode until the money and the daylight both ran thin, and stepped off at a rail junction town called Millbrook, where 3 lines crossed in a tangle of freight yards and grain elevators. And where nobody knew her name or her shame, which felt, in that moment, like its own small mercy. She meant only to find a room for the night and decide her next move in the morning, but the depot clerk, a talkative young man named Nathaniel Pruitt, noticed her carpet bag and her tired, careful eyes and, perhaps out of simple loneliness for conversation, told her about the auction happening that very afternoon behind the old freight house. The railroad, he explained, was clearing out a siding of long-abandoned rolling stock to make room for new track. And among the cars going for scrap money was one that had sat sealed and untouched for as long as anyone in Millbrook could remember, a boxcar numbered 117 that 3 generations of locksmiths, blacksmiths, and curious boys had tried and failed to open, its heavy iron door fused shut by rust and time and, some said, by something darker that nobody cared to name aloud. It was, Nathaniel said with a laugh, the auctioneer's standing joke, the item nobody wanted, and the railroad would be glad to have any fool haul it away for whatever it could get. Adeline should have found a room and slept. Instead, something in her, some old habit of her father's voice telling her that a lock was only a conversation waiting for the right ear, drew her toward the freight yard instead. She stood at the edge of a small, indifferent crowd of townsfolk who had come more for the entertainment of watching things they did not want get bought than out of any real interest. And she watched the auctioneer wave dismissively at car 117 sitting rusted and lopsided on its overgrown spur. Its great sliding door bound shut with a fused iron mechanism unlike anything on the newer cars around it. Nobody bid. The auctioneer, eager to be rid of it, finally looked out at the crowd and said he would let it go for $5 just to clear the siding before nightfall. Adeline heard her own voice before she had quite decided to speak, offering the $5 she could not afford to lose. And the crowd's soft laughter followed her all the way to the little clerk's table where she signed the bill of sale. Because everyone standing there could see exactly what she could not yet admit to herself, that a ruined woman had just spent nearly her last dollar on a rusted, forgotten box that could not even be opened. She spent that first night in a rented room above the feed store, and in the morning she walked back out to the siding alone, in the gray early light. and studied the door of car 117 the way her father had taught her to study any stubborn lock, not with frustration, but with curiosity. As though the mechanism were trying to tell her something and simply needed time to be heard. The lock itself, she saw once she'd scraped away decades of rust and grime, was no ordinary railroad seal. It was a heavy internal bolt mechanism, the kind meant to be thrown from inside the car, reinforced with an outer padlock so corroded it had fused into a single lump of iron and dirt. Someone, she realized slowly, had locked this door from within, and someone else, much later, had added that outer lock to make certain it never opened again. It took her the better part of 4 days, working with oil, patience, a small file, and the same steady unhurried hands her father had trained 30 years before. To finally coax the outer lock apart, and a 5th day more before the internal bolt, stiff with 3.5 decades of rust, finally gave way with a groan that seemed to come from the whole car at once. The door slid open perhaps 8 inches before jamming against its own rusted track, and warm, stale, dust-thick air breathed out at her like something exhaling after a very long-held breath. In the dim bar of light that fell into the car, Adeline saw first the outline of old crates, their markings faded, and beyond them, half collapsed against the far wall. What she first took for a bundle of forgotten cargo and then, with a cold understanding that made her step back from the door, recognized as the remains of a man who had lain there undisturbed since long before she had ever heard the name Millbrook. She did not scream, though her hands shook badly enough that she had to sit down on the step outside the car and breathe for a long while before she trusted herself to look again. When she did look, gently, respectfully, the way she imagined her own father would have wanted her to treat any person, living or dead, she saw that the man had been dressed as a railroad worker. His coat's brass buttons still bearing the mark of the very line that ran through Millbrook, and tucked inside that coat, protected all these years by wool and stillness. A small leather journal and a pocket watch, its case engraved with initials that were not his own but, she would later learn, his daughter's parting gift. She went first to Nathaniel Pruitt at the depot, not the sheriff, because something in her instinct told her this was a matter that had been buried on purpose and ought to be uncovered carefully. And Nathaniel, pale and shaken, fetched the town's aging doctor and, reluctantly, the sheriff, a heavy-set, unhurried man named Otis Bell who had only been a boy of 10 the last time car 117 had been spoken of in Millbrook without a shudder. It was Otis Bell, standing in the yard with his hat in his hands, who finally said the name that made half the gathering townspeople go quiet, Jonas Coe. 38 years before, in the autumn of 1859, the eastbound express had carried the quarterly mill payroll for the entire Millbrook Valley. Some $40,000 in gold coin meant for the workers of the grain mills and the rail crews alike, and somewhere along that stretch of track the payroll had vanished, along with the baggage handler assigned to guard it. The town had never doubted, not for a single day, that Jonas Coe, a freedman who had worked the rail line for 6 years and kept to himself, had simply taken the gold and disappeared into the west. And his name had been spoken with contempt in Millbrook ever since, his memory a byword for betrayal, his family, what little remained of it, shunned so thoroughly that his granddaughter Ruth Coe, who still lived on the edge of town taking in washing to survive, had grown up never once hearing a kind word said about the grandfather she had never known. Adeline sat that evening with the journal Jonas Coe had carried in his coat for 38 years, and by lamplight, her hands trembling now from something other than fear. She read a dead man's last account of himself. He had written, in a careful, deliberate hand that spoke of a man who valued words the way she valued locks. That he had discovered the young railroad agent Silas Grieve tampering with the payroll safe that night, that he had confronted him, that there had been a struggle in the moving car. And that rather than let Grieve escape with the gold, Coe had wrestled the strongbox behind a false panel he himself had built into the car months before for exactly such an emergency, and had thrown the internal bolt to seal himself inside with it, trusting that the train would be stopped and searched before harm could come to him. Grieve, in his panic, had instead uncoupled the car at a lonely siding, left it forgotten, and reported to the railroad and the town that Coe had stolen the payroll and fled. A lie made easier to believe, Coe had written with a bitterness Adeline could feel through the page. By every assumption Millbrook had already been eager to make about a black man they had never bothered to know. He had written that he expected rescue within days. He had not known that Silas Grieve, terrified of discovery, would arrange for the siding to be quietly abandoned. The spur marked for scrapping in railroad paperwork that somehow never reached anyone who might have investigated, and that 38 years would pass before another living soul opened that door. Word of what had been found in car 117 moved through Millbrook faster than the telegraph could have carried it. And within 2 days Adeline found herself standing in the sheriff's small office across from a man she had not expected to meet so soon, Silas Grieve himself, now the elderly, silver-templed founder of Millbrook's only bank, a man whose fortune, it was quietly said, had grown from nothing in the years just after the payroll robbery into the largest in the valley. A man who had spent 38 years being thanked publicly for the railroad's growth and the town's prosperity. He came to the sheriff's office not out of guilt, he made clear, but out of what he called concern for a grieving widow who had clearly been overcome by the shock of a gruesome discovery and was. He suggested gently to Otis Bell, perhaps not thinking clearly about what she believed she had read in the ramblings of a man everyone in town had known to be a thief. Adeline had spent 22 years learning to read the small, careful movements of men who did not want to be understood, and she watched Silas Grieve's hands as he spoke. The way they would not quite stay still in his lap, the way his eyes moved to the journal on the sheriff's desk and away again, too quickly, too often. She said nothing of her suspicion aloud that first meeting. Instead she asked, in a voice she kept as steady as any lock mechanism, whether the bank might have records from 1859, ledgers, deposits, anything from the season the payroll vanished, purely. She said, to help the sheriff understand the full picture. Grieve's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes did, and he told her that records from so long ago had surely been lost to time, fire, and the ordinary disorder of an old institution. A claim Otis Bell, to his credit, wrote down without comment but with a small frown that suggested he, too, had noticed how quickly the answer had come. The town divided almost immediately. There were those, mostly older residents who remembered the panic of 1859 and had built 38 years of certainty around Jonas Coe's guilt. Who resented a stranger arriving with a $5 boxcar and a dead man's diary to unsettle everything they had believed comfortable and settled. Ruth Coe herself, when Adeline finally found the courage to visit her small washing house on the edge of town, received the news with a wariness that broke Adeline's heart more than any accusation could have, because Ruth had spent 30 years being told her grandfather was a thief. And she had built her whole quiet, careful life around simply surviving that shame, not around hoping it might someday be undone. Silas Grieve, meanwhile, began quietly making his own moves. Offering to buy the boxcar and its contents outright from Adeline for a sum that would have solved every practical trouble in her life at once, and when she declined, gently but firmly. Explaining that the journal and the man's remains deserved to go to his family and to the truth rather than into a banker's private safe, Grieve's manner cooled considerably. And within the week Adeline began to notice the small, deniable cruelties of a powerful man displeased. The boarding house suddenly had no rooms for her. The feed store where she had found honest work mending locks for grain sacks suddenly had no further need of her services, and Otis Bell, though not unkind, began finding reasons to delay any formal inquiry into records the bank claimed no longer existed. It would have been easy, in those weeks, for Adeline to simply leave, to sell what little the boxcar contained and start over somewhere Silas Grieve's shadow did not reach, and there were nights, cold and uncertain, when she considered exactly that. But she kept returning to her father's old teaching, that a lock was a conversation, and she began to understand that Silas Grieve's smooth denials were themselves a kind of lock. One built not of iron but of 38 years of a town's comfortable silence, and that silence, like any mechanism, could be understood if she was patient enough to study it properly. She spent her evenings not brooding but working, quietly interviewing the oldest residents of Millbrook one by one under the guise of simple friendly conversation. Learning that the mill workers of 1859 had never in fact received their promised payroll that autumn, that the mills had nearly closed for want of wages. And that it was in the very spring following the robbery that Silas Grieve, then a minor railroad clerk with no family money to speak of, had suddenly possessed enough capital to found Millbrook's first bank. She found an aging former mill foreman, a man named Adam Kessler, who still remembered, with the sharp bitterness of a wrong never righted, that the mill owners had been told the entire payroll had been recovered from the thief co's abandoned belongings and simply misappropriated by careless railroad accounting. A story that had let everyone stop asking questions at exactly the moment true questions ought to have begun. Piece by piece, patiently, the way she had once coaxed a stubborn tumbler into finally turning, Adeline assembled what amounted to a confession Silas Grieve had never spoken aloud. A young clerk's opportunity, a struggle in a moving railcar, a lie easy to tell because the town was already primed to believe the worst of a black man and the best of a white one. And 38 years of quiet, comfortable prosperity built on a debt never paid to the workers who were owed it or the man who died trying to protect it. The reckoning came, in the end, not through violence or courtroom drama but through the same patient exposure Adeline had practiced her whole life. She brought Adam Kessler and 2 other former mill workers who remembered that unpaid payroll to Otis Bell together, their combined memories forming a weight of testimony that could no longer be waved away as an old woman's grief-addled fancy, and she brought, too, the strongbox itself, still sealed behind the false panel Jonas Co. had built, which Otis Bell finally agreed to have opened formally, with witnesses present, in the town square rather than any private office. When the panel came away and the strongbox was lifted into the gray autumn daylight, and its lid finally forced, the assembled crowd of Millbrook fell into a silence unlike anything the town had known in 38 years, because there, tarnished but whole, sat the entire lost payroll of 1859. $40,000 in gold coin that Jonas Co. had died rather than let vanish, coin that Silas Grieve had always known remained hidden and untouchable in that sealed car, and had spent 38 years hoping the world would simply forget existed at all. Silas Grieve did not go to prison. Too many years and too much law separated him from a crime nobody in power wished fully prosecuted, and Adeline, who had not sought vengeance so much as truth, found she did not much mourn that particular outcome. What she wanted, and what she pursued instead with the same quiet determination she had once given to broken locks, was restoration. The gold, by unanimous agreement of the mill workers' surviving families and the town council, newly humbled and eager to distance itself from Grieve's long shadow, was placed into a trust for the valley's mill families, the very debt it had always owed finally paid, 38 years late but paid nonetheless. Silas Grieve, exposed before the whole town as a man who had built his fortune on a dead man's silence, watched his bank's depositors withdraw their trust along with their money within a single season, and lived out his remaining years in a diminished, watchful quiet that Adeline came to understand was its own particular justice, the kind that asks no court's permission and needs none. Ruth Co., who had spent her whole life carrying a shame that was never hers to carry, stood at last in the town square as Otis Bell read aloud a formal proclamation clearing her grandfather's name. And Adeline watched the woman's shoulders, bent for 30 years under an invisible weight, finally straighten, and thought that this, more than any gold, was the true thing she had been sent to Millbrook to find. Jonas Co. was given a proper burial at last, in the small churchyard on the hill above the depot, his pocket watch and journal placed with him, his headstone naming him at last for what he had always been, a man who died protecting what was not his to lose, rather than the thief the town had been too comfortable to question. And so it came to pass that Adeline Marsh, who had arrived in Millbrook with $4.60 and a stranger's carpet bag, who had spent her last $5 on a rusted, forgotten boxcar that every sensible person in town had laughed at her for buying, found that the true value of that purchase had never been the gold locked inside it at all, though the gold mattered greatly to the families it finally reached. The true value had been the same thing her father taught her at his workbench 30 years before, that a lock, however stubborn, however long ignored, is only a conversation waiting for someone patient enough to listen, and that a person cast aside, whether an old boxcar on a forgotten siding or a woman turned out by her own husband's brother, is very often simply misunderstood, not without worth. Millbrook, in the years that followed, would remember her not as the fool who paid $5 for a rusted car nobody could open, but as the woman who opened it anyway. And in doing so opened something far larger in the town itself. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us and with Adeline. If this story stirred something in you, we would be glad if you shared it with someone who might need to hear it tonight, and we would love to know, in the comments below, of a time you found real value in something the rest of the world had already written off as worthless. Until next time, stay close.